Just give me 1 second. Okay. So hello, everybody. Welcome to Introduction to Adobe InDesign. My name is Diego Delgado. Here's my email. You can contact me at any time through this email with any InDesign, design in general, or Adobe related questions. Just anything that comes to mind, send an email anytime. Before or after this class, doesn't really matter. Just I'll try and get back to you on anything you might have to say. Like I said, I'm Diego Delgado, and I am a student at the University of New Mexico. I have been studying graphic design and computer science for the past 3 years or so. And I just want to thank REC6 and REC9 for working with me to bring this training to you today. All right, let's get started. So this is a class on Adobe InDesign. What is Adobe InDesign? Adobe InDesign is a publishing and page layout or pagination software. It is Adobe's main software for that purpose. It's great for flyers, brochures, magazines, newspapers, books, ebooks, and much more. Pretty much anything that you would organize on a sheet of paper or a digital equivalence of something you would organize onto a sheet of paper. So pagination, what is pagination? Pagination is the process of dividing and or organizing a document into pages. I said pagination. I've heard some people call it pagination. I've heard it both ways. I don't necessarily know which one is correct. Microsoft Word is probably the most well-known pagination software. It doesn't have quite the same like aesthetic design properties as Adobe InDesign, but you can definitely use it to make a handful of things. Plenty of people do their resumes, flyers, things like that in Microsoft Word. But we're going to be going over Adobe InDesign specifically in this training today. All right, so that was just introduction to what pagination is. But before we get started on actually diving into Adobe InDesign itself and some of the things you're going to need to know for it, is there any questions at all whatsoever? Just before we start diving into the real meat of this training. All right, if there are no questions, that we're just going to continue. But feel free to chime in at any point if you do have a question. And I'll be stopping periodically to take more. All right, so the first thing we're going to be talking about is file types as they apply to Adobe InDesign. Now, if you've been in any of my other Adobe trainings, some of this might be a little bit of review, but there's just a couple of notes that I want to make about file types as they apply to InDesign that are a little bit different from what we might have discussed in the Photoshop, Illustrator, or Spark class. So the most common file types in InDesign are INDD files, PNG, PDF, JPEG, and something cool about Adobe InDesign and a bunch of the products in the Adobe suite is that you can take files from other Adobe products and you can actually use them kind of interchangeably between the softwares. And we're actually going to show that either a little bit later or this afternoon when we actually get into the project portion of this lesson. All right, so starting off, we have the INDD or .INDD file. It is an actual InDesign document. This is the native file type to Adobe InDesign. It's lossless because it's the entire original file from Adobe InDesign. Something to consider when you're working with INDD files or lossless compression in general is that large files are going to take up a lot of memory on your computer, especially if you have a lot of them. And something that might be a drawback when you're concerned of sharing and maybe working in collaboration with someone else on a project is that you need access to Adobe InDesign to open and edit InDesign documents. So that's just something to consider. The next file type is PNG or .png files. PNG stands for Portable Network Graphics. It supports lossless compression for raster graphics and image data. Again, when you're working with lossless compression, it might take a lot of memory if you have a bunch of them. They are still preferred sometimes over TIFF files, and we're not going to be covering TIFF files as much, but it's important to remember that they're kind of the leading lossless compression file type, in my opinion, and they're good for web design. Cool thing about PNGs is that they support transparency, and we're going to work on a little bit of transparency a little bit later. I'm going to show you how that applies to InDesign. All right, next we have PDF or .pdf files. PDF stands for Portable Document Format. It also supports lossless compression for raster or vector graphics. And a cool thing about PDFs is that you can actually embed content into them, things like hyperlinks and stuff like that. Like you have an image and you can click on it and it takes you to a web page, stuff like that. Editable in Adobe Acrobat. So if you're going to go that route, if you're going to put a button or a hyperlink or something like that into your PDF, I highly recommend using Adobe Acrobat if that's something that you have access to. Okay, and then we have JPEG or .jpeg files. Stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group. JPEGs are a lossy format, meaning you're going to lose a little bit of image data and it's going to be compressed every time you save it. But a perk of lossy formats is that lossy formats equal smaller files because you're actually losing image data. It's mainly going to focus on retaining color information and it disregards other image data. So if color is something really important to you, maybe consider a JPEG. JPEGs, because they're a lossy format and they compress really well, they're really often used in web design because web pages load them pretty easily and pretty quickly. All right, so you probably heard me say compression a couple times. Again, if you were in any of my other Adobe classes, this might be a little bit of a refresher. So what is compression? And more importantly, what is lossless compression? This is just the Wikipedia snippet of what lossless compression actually is. Lossless compression is a class of data compression that allows the original data to be perfectly reconstructed from the compressed data with no loss of information. Lossless compression is possible because most real-world data exhibits statistical redundancy. By contrast, lossy compression permits reconstruction only of an approximation of the original data, though usually with great improved compression rates and therefore reduced media size. So that's a long-winded and fancy way of saying that you lose a little bit of actual image data when you use lossy compression, whereas lossless compression, it's pretty much exactly the original data and the original image. Okay, moving on. Actually, no, before we move on, are there any questions on any of those file types, saving, compression, lossless compression? In a little bit, I am going to give you guys a reference sheet with a little bit of additional information on compression and what lossless compression is versus lossy compression.
No questions.
No questions? All right. If there are no questions, then we will just keep moving along. All right, color modes as they apply to InDesign. Now, before I get into color modes, there is something that I want to point out. InDesign is a pagination software. It's made for organizing things into pages. And therefore, you're mostly going to be using it for printed media. That's not to say you can't use it for digital media. You definitely can. And I'm not in any way trying to discourage you from using it for digital media, but it's mostly going to be printed media because, I mean, most things that are organized into pages are printed. And even if you are making something digitally, it probably has a real world printed counterpart. Like, let's say you're making a menu. You might want a menu for your restaurant, but and you might want to put that menu online, but it's going to have a real world counterpart probably, or maybe a book. You have a digital and a printed version of a book. Even if you have a digital version of the book or an ebook, it's probably going to have a printed counterpart. So something to consider as we step through some of this information is that InDesign is mostly used for printed media, but that's not necessarily a hard rule. Okay, so let's go into color modes. Color modes. What are color modes? Color modes refer to the settings that designers use to display colors in a consistent and measurable way. Some common color modes are RGB, CMYK, lab, index, grayscale, and bitmapping. You're probably only ever going to work with RGB and CMYK though. Those other ones, if you get a little bit more professional, if you're working maybe with printers and really high quality prints and inks and stuff like that, you might look into some of those others, but we're mostly going to be using RGB and CMYK in honestly most design regards. So starting off with RGB, RGB stands for red, green, and blue. RGB is commonly found in digital formats. Individual pixels represent red, green, and blue. If you were to, an example of where you might actually see this in the real world is if you've ever got like a water droplet on your phone, you kind of see this red, green, and blue pattern on the screen underneath the water droplet. And that's because the water is actually magnifying those individual little pixels, and you can actually see the red, green, and blue pixels that make up the screen. And then there's CMYK. CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. The K in CMYK stands for black. It's commonly used in print formats, and there's a reason for that. Printer cartridges most often come in CMYK. There's the cyan cartridge, there's a magenta cartridge, there's a yellow cartridge, and there's a black cartridge. And as such, you're mostly going to be working with CMYK color modes if you intend to print the media that you're working on. Okay, so choosing a color mode. You should try and choose a color mode when you're setting up your InDesign document. You can always change it later, but if you're working in one color mode, it's usually just easy to stick with the color mode you use when you set it up. Again, the main thing you want to consider when choosing the color mode or format is how your media is going to be shown. Use CMYK if it's going to be printed, and use RGB if your media is going to be digital. And since we're working with InDesign, mostly pagination, you're probably going to be working with CMYK most of the time. All right. Are there any questions on color modes before we move on?
No questions.
All righty, awesome. Well, if there are no questions, we'll just be moving right along. All right, so now we're going to be discussing width, height, and resolution. Again, if you've been in any of my other Adobe classes, this might just be a little bit of a refresher, but it's important to go over. So with height and resolution, it's starting off with width and height. Width and height are measured in pixels, inches, centimeters, millimeters, points, and picas. In most Adobe products, these are the units that you're going to be working with, and you can change the units of a document at pretty much any time. A lot of times when I'm working with InDesign, I'm working based off of a standard sheet of printer paper, which is 8.5 by 11 inches. So I like to have my document set up in inches. You pretty much work with these other sizes if you want to be a little bit more precise. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later when we actually open up an InDesign document. All right, so resolution. Resolution is measured in pixels per inch or pixels per centimeter most of the time. 72 pixels per inch is the standard for the web, but don't be afraid to increase it based on your circumstances. Like if I'm going for a really high quality print, or I'm working with something that I really want to have smooth lines and look really crisp and clean, I'll go well above 32 pixels per inch. 300 is pretty much where I work most of the time, actually. All right. So width, height, and resolution, and the respective increments that they work in. Are there any questions on that? All right. If there are no questions, we're going to move right along, and we're going to be getting into some material that is specific to branding. So this is a completely new topic. We haven't really talked about branding too much in any of my other Adobe classes. So you guys are going to be getting something a little bit fresh here. All right. So when we're working with branding, I like the camphor, or I'm probably just butchered that pronunciation. I think it's German. The camphor model, the camphor prism model helps designers to establish a brand identity. And it consists of 6 dimensions: physique, personality, culture, relationship, reflection, and self-image. And this is just a graphic that kind of shows how you break up all of those dimensions into a model. We're going to be going through them step by step. Starting off with physique. Physique refers to the physical features that come to mind when the brand is mentioned. Like questions to ask when you're thinking of your personal brand's physique are, what does the brand look like necessarily? What will the consumers do with this imagery? Some examples that I like of physique are Dairy Queen's iconic ice cream shapes. Their soft serve isn't the usual star tipped spiral kind of ice cream. It's kind of more domey almost. And when I think of Dairy Queen, I think of that. You could think of a sports team's mascot as part of the physique of the sports team's personal brand, or Hard Rock Cafe's iconic guitars. Those are just some examples of physique as they apply to some common brands. Now, I asked you earlier to think of brands that you are comfortable with, brands that you consume, brands that you appreciate, anything like that. And as we step through here, and as we step through these dimensions of the prism model, I want you to think of how they apply to your brand personally. I think someone said Chevy earlier. So physique of Chevy, you might think, mud and rugged trucks and the logo and stuff like that. What images come to mind when you think of your brand? All right, moving right along, we're going to go into personality. Personality is the character of the brand. And one way that you can think about this is, if the brand were a person, what would they be like? What character traits does the brand have? Some examples that I like are Toys R Us. If Toys R Us was a person, they'd probably be a bit childish, friendly, and energetic. Ferrari would be like luxurious, elegant, and sporty. And then sometimes brands will do this thing where they actually pick a person to represent the brand. And then you associate the brand as being like that person. An example is Mint Mobile. The owner, Ryan Reynolds. I actually don't know if he's the actual owner, but they say he is in the commercials. Ryan Reynolds. When I think Mint Mobile, I think Ryan Reynolds. And his personality traits kind of cascade into the personality that the brand gives off. Flow from Progressive Insurance, exactly. They're like the face of the face of the brand, and having a person as the face of the brand really contributes to the personality of the brand. All right, moving right along, culture. Culture refers to the values and or principles that the brand is bases its behavior on. Culture is the bridge between the brand and the organization. Something to consider is that country of origin is often linked to the cultural associations of that brand. So, for example, Mercedes-Benz. It's a German brand, and so you might think of stereotypical traditional German values associated with that brand. Hardworking, precise, like very detail oriented, stuff like that. And then on the other side, you have Ford. It's an American brand. It's strong, it's rugged, it's hardworking. Think of just the commercials, right? When you have Mercedes-Benz commercials, you've got like the guy in the lab coat, you know, you've got the scientists and they're in like the cool white lit lab, and they've got computers and holograms and stuff like that, and it's showing scientificness and precision, versus, you know, like a Ford truck commercial where it's like there's mud and there's a big uh, 4x4 and it's pulling a tree stump out of the ground with chains, and there's men's hands with gloves and stuff like that. That's part of the culture of the brand. That's what they're trying to give off. They're trying to appeal to the cultural aspect of things. However, country of origin is not the only way that you can get a culture for a brand. Whole Foods, you know, that's nothing, has nothing to do with country of origin. They are trying to promote a green culture. It's, you think healthy and fresh when you think of Whole Foods. Their brand, their logo is green. It's not necessarily a country's culture, but a culture nonetheless. Subaru, love and dogs. Yeah, exactly. It's like the values that the brand associates itself with. That's exactly right. All right, moving on. We have relationship. Brands will often symbolize a certain kind of relationship between people or themselves and the people they serve. What relationship do you want to have with the people that your brand is interacting with? That's something to consider when you're thinking of how relationship applies to your brand. Some examples include politicians. A lot of times they portray a boss and servant kind of relationship. They try and make themselves sound like they are servants of the people, and they are there for you, and that's kind of the relationship that they try and give off. Pepperidge Farms, you know, they try and give off this image of an old friend. You know, Pepperidge Farm members, you know, they like to glorify the good old days and how things used to be between you two, and how it's just like romanticism. And then we've got State Farm Insurance, probably the most on the nose. It's in their jingle, a good neighbor. They try and give off the image of having a good neighborly relationship with their consumers. All right, moving right along. We've got reflection, and this is reflection of the consumer. Reflection refers to the stereotypical user of the brand. Keep in mind that this does not necessarily equal the target demographic of the brand. Some examples include Apple. They portray themselves to be classy, creative, and exclusive, when in reality, the demographic for Apple is actually a lot bigger than people that only fall into that category. This is not about who actually consumes the product or interacts with your brand. It's about what society has kind of decided the stereotypical image of people that interact with your brand are like. Sportswear brands are a great example of this. The stereotype might be athletes, you know, really sporty and active and healthy people, when in reality, there's plenty of people that buy sportswear that are not necessarily in that category exclusively. Game consoles, people, the companies that develop game consoles. The stereotype is, you know, they're mostly young, they're quirky and confident, and they're a little bit silly and stuff like that. Everyone buys game consoles. Plenty of people buy game consoles. It's not exclusive to that demographic exclusively. All right, moving right along, we have self-image. Self-image is a little bit different. It's basically the inverse of the previous slide, which was reflection. It's how the consumers see themselves. Some examples might include Supreme. If you're a consumer of Supreme, you might see yourself as wealthy and high fashion. Beats, you might think of yourself as hip and youthful. You might consider yourself to be a bit of an audiophile if you own Beats, or you're passionate about the Beats brand. Or Muscle Milk, you might think of yourself as strong, athletic, or swole. You know, you exercise, you lift weights, you're a strong kind of person. Again, this doesn't necessarily have to be true either. It's just how your consumers or the people that interact with your brand likely see themselves. All right, so that was the Kempferer prism model of brand identity. Are there any questions on that?
No, good examples.
Good. All right. Now, if anyone would like to share, I'm going to go through uh, these last few slides that I'd had, starting with physique. Would anyone like to share a brand that they thought of and tell me how physique um, applies to that brand? And if you need refresher, physique is the physical features that come to mind when that brand is mentioned. If no one wants to share, we'll move right along. But I think that it can help to get a little bit of dialogue in here.
Hi, Diego.
Hello.
I put Chevy in there, and I think like when I think of physique, I think of like being tough and durable and that kind of thing. So I think that's sort of the image that Chevy represents.
Right. I think you're right. I think that that's an appropriate analysis of the Chevy brand in general. I think you're right. I think they try and make themselves look tough and strong and built to last and stuff like that. Durable. Great example. All right. Moving on to personality. Would anyone like to take personality and give me their how personality applies to their brand? Coca-Cola, the shape of the glass bottle. That is a great example. The mirror workout thing. Okay, I think I see what you're saying there. Would anyone like to take personality? An example of personality as it applies to their brand?
What about like Obey, the Shepherd Ferry brand? Because that's a social justice stance. It kind of stands out that way.
Oh yeah, definitely. Anytime you're dealing with like morality with that's associated with the brand, you're definitely going to have some big personality associated with it. That's a really good example. All right, culture. Anyone want to share? And we
The
can just
Navajo
move.
Nation logo.
What was that?
Navajo Nation logo.
Oh, that's a really good one. Um, and oh yeah, absolutely. That's an example of like I said, the it's basically portraying like an actual culture. It's not like Whole Foods, you know, where it's like a like kind of an invented thing. It's like a people. It's representative of the people that it relates to. That's a good example. That's a really good example. Uh, relationship, and I think so that we have enough time, we'll just move on after relationship. Would anyone like to discuss relationship? Relationship is kind of hard because it's a little bit um more abstract. Like it's hard to think of how you could have like a one-on-one person relationship um with a brand. Enterprise car rental. What kind of relationship do you think that they um give off with their consumers?
They'll pick you up.
Oh yeah, that's I completely forgot that that was like their tagline. Yeah, that's definitely a good one. Like friendly. Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, awesome examples, everyone. Um, we only have two left. Would anyone like to talk about reflection? If no one wants to, we can just move on. But like I said, I think it's good to get a little bit of back and forth with these. The stereotypical user of a product and what they seem like in reference to that product.
I think for Chevy, back to my Chevy example, it's like hardworking.
Yeah,
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 hardworking and dependable.
yeah. That's another good example because it's not necessarily exclusively representative of everyone that owns a Chevy, but it's the stereotype of the Chevy brand and the consumers of Chevy. That's a great example. All right, lastly, self-image, how people see themselves, how consumers of a specific product see themselves. Anyone want to take that?
I would say Apple. Usually, people who are into Apple are usually up with the latest technology.
Oh yeah, like what's the word for when you're always current on technology? It's not like yeah, I guess like hip.
Early adopter.
Early adopter, that's the word I'm looking for. Yeah, absolutely. I think that they probably see themselves as always up to date on the latest technology because they think that Apple is like the forefront of all of it. That's a great example. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your interaction. All right, so that is everything we're going to talk about. I just want to check in with you guys and see if you are comfortable with the concepts of pagination, the file types associated with Adobe InDesign, color modes, specifically RGB and CMYK color modes, with height and resolution, and all of the branding prism. If everyone's good on that, we're going to actually hop over into Adobe InDesign, and we're going to be doing a bit of a tutorial. We're not going to do any kind of huge project yet, but we're going to kind of get your feet wet with most of the tools we're going to be using. All right. If everyone's good, we're just going to jump right into it. And I'm actually going to share with you guys a link to some of these documents so that you can use them, follow along if you get Adobe InDesign, if you already have Adobe InDesign. And I don't plan on breaking this link, so it'll be available forever. So let me just get that for you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen real quick. And again, keep in mind you can chime in at any time to ask questions, and my email is always available if questions arise after the class has ended. Let me just get this link real quick. Sorry, it's taking a little bit of time. I think it's the weather in my area is kind of making the internet connection a bit slow. All right, copy link, and let me bring it back to you guys. I'm going to just put it in the chat. It's just a Google Docs. It's going to have a little bit of information on some of the things we've talked about. Some of these resources, they say Adobe Photoshop on them, but they are not exclusive to Adobe Photoshop. It's just like Adobe wrote the article pertaining to Photoshop, but I mean, color modes are always color modes. So it doesn't really matter what software you're working on. A lot of the information is going to be true regardless. All right, here you go. That is the information. I'm going to share my screen again, and we are going to open up if you scroll down in that document to a toolbar tutorial, If you want to download that, that is what we're going to be working on right now. So let me go back to Zoom, open up that document. All right, why did my screen not share? All right. Hold on, it's just loading. All right. So when you open up your InDesign document, or the tutorial specifically, this is probably what you're going to have. It's going to look something like this. Just something to get out of the way right out of the gate is this center graphic in the middle. It probably looks a little bit chalky. I think that's the default by Adobe InDesign. But I assure you that the graphic is actually a lot more high resolution than that. And to fix that, you're going to go to View, and you're going to go to Display Performance. It's probably set on typical display. This is for performance purposes, but to see what the graphic will actually look like, if you were to save it, print it, anything like that, click on High Quality Display, and it'll show you what the actual graphic looks like. That's just a thing that this software does that that's a little bit frustrating. And something that I want to point out before we get too far into this is that I believe Miss Armantrout asked if you don't have access to Adobe InDesign, the cool thing about design softwares is a lot of times the skills are transferable. A lot of the tools are the same across different softwares. Even the icons a lot of times are the same. So yeah, that's just something to consider. For some reason, my toolbar is not showing. Let me see, why is my toolbar missing? I'm going to try closing this and opening it again. Sometimes that fixes it. And that's the thing is a lot of times these softwares, they're great, but they're still buggy from time to time. So you probably that's just something that you need to work with. It's a pain, but that's the way it is. All right. So actually, no, this is good because now I can show you guys how to open up a file from scratch. If you don't open up a InDesign document and you just open up the InDesign application, and you want to make something from scratch, you're going to probably get this page. But if you're starting for the first time, you're probably not going to have this recent section because there's going to be nothing that you've worked on before. You might have some other dialog boxes that'll tell you about tutorials and things that Adobe's offering and stuff like that. You can close those, or you can walk through them. You can go through the guide, but maybe not right now because we're in the middle of a lesson. All right, so new file, this big blue button right here, you're going to click on that. You're going to get this little dialog box, and this is where we're going to actually apply some of the stuff we were talking about. We're immediately presented with width, height, and we're going to have options for resolution a little bit later on. And another thing is this software has so many options for pretty much everything you would expect from a pagination software. Margins, bleed, stuff like that. If you've ever printed anything, you know that you can't print your content all the way to the edges of the paper, depending on your printer, but most of the time you can't print all the way to the edges. So that's where things like bleed and slug come in. That helps you to only your graphic where the printer is actually going to be able to print to. But for the purposes of this lesson, we're just going to set up a regular document. And like I said, I like working in a regular workspace of an 8.5 by 11 printer sheet of paper. So I'm going to switch over to inches, make sure it's 8.5 by 11, and the orientation is upright. I'm not going to mess around with any of the other settings, and we're going to click create. Might take a second, and there we go. We've got an open document, blank document. It's got nothing in it. You can see the margins around the screen. And we're just going to jump right into this. we're gonna break down this toolbar over here on the left, because I think that that's where you're gonna be doing 90% of your work from. So the very top one, it's called the selection tool. And there's keyboard commands and hotkeys for pretty much everything in all of the Adobe products. Some of them are useful to remember. I mean, you're probably not going to have to remember all of them. We're going to be using them very limitedly. There's cheat sheets and stuff like that online that'll help you out if that's something that you feel like you want to work with. But we're just going to be clicking on them for the time being. So the selection tool is exactly what it sounds like. It's for making selections, and disregard what I'm doing right now. I'm just going to put a box in here so that I can actually show you what that looks like. All right, so we've got the selection tool. You use the selection tool to select things. And with the selection tool, you can drag stuff around and select it and do stuff with it. It's pretty basic. It's the most basic tool probably in the entire app, but that's what it is. To navigate the document, to kind of move around and stuff like that, hold down your space bar and then click and drag. And that's how you move around. It's probably one of the only hotkeys that I recommend knowing. Space bar and click and drag, and that's how you move your document around. Moving on, we have the direct selection tool. And honestly, the direct selection tool in Adobe InDesign is not like the direct selection tool in Adobe Illustrator. I don't want to say it's useless, because it probably has its purposes, but I almost never use it. It seems like there's better ways to do what it has to offer. And let me show you what I mean by that. Again, disregard what I'm doing. I'm just gonna do something real quick for demonstration's sake. I'm gonna bring in an image into InDesign. And what you use the direction selection tool for is you can select items that are placed within frames. And so what I mean by that is, you see this outline right here? That's the frame that the image was placed inside. And I am moving the image within that frame, but not the frame itself. It's kind of confusing. That's why I don't really think that the direct selection tool is all that useful or all that powerful. But it's definitely something to consider. Most of the time, I think you're going to be using the actual selection tool. You can accomplish the same exact thing by hovering over the frame. And you'll see this little circle in the middle. You can click and drag that, and it accomplishes the same exact thing. It's a little bit silly. It's a little bit redundant, but that's what the direct selection tool does. Okay. Then we've got the page tool. Let me make sure nothing's selected, actually. Okay. Then we've got the page tool. The page tool is, if you were in the Illustrator session, it's very similar to the artboards tool. It's what you use to actually modify your page, your document that you're putting your content on. You can click and drag, and it'll kind of show you like a preview of what it'll be. But if you let go, it'll snap back to normal. It's not going to actually make modifications unless you click on that corner and you drag and you hold the Alt key down. If you hold the Alt key down, click and drag, then it's actually going to make modifications to your document. Okay, moving on, we have the gap tool. The gap tool is a way, it's pretty much only used for making appropriate spacing of elements on your document. And what do I mean by that is, if I go over here, you're going to see it's going to highlight areas that the software is recognizing as having a gap. There is a gap between this element and the edge of the page. There's a gap between this element and this element. Notice that you get a little cross out circle if you try and hover over an actual element itself, because there's not a gap there. It's actually being populated by a real thing. So you use this, you can click and drag, and it makes spacing, basically. It just creates spacing. You see, it's modifying the size and shape of the space between the two art frames. All right, so that's the gap tool. Let me reset everything just so it's back to normal. Okay, because we're going to need everything back to normal for this next one. This is the content collector tool. The content collector tool is, again, kind of silly because it's basically the copy paste function that everyone is probably used to. You select the content collector tool, and then you select content, and it adds it to this nice little tray down here. And then you hover over the content collector tool over here in the toolbar. You click and hold, it'll give you more options. You select the content placer tool. Now your cursor is loaded with the content that you selected, and you can put it down as many times as you want, pretty much, as long as you don't have it selected. Ooh. Yeah, so it's basically copy paste, but it's maybe a little bit more intuitive to be able to have custom sizes and stuff like that. But it's pretty much just copy paste. It's Adobe basically making a proprietary version of Control-C, Control-V. If you have to run, that's fine. I think that you guys got plenty of information from this morning. And we're just going to be finishing up this toolbar here. All right, so let me get rid of that. Next, we have the type tool. It's for adding text to your document. It's you can drag out a text box and you can put text in it. It's very similar to the text tools that we've been working with in the other products. And if you were in the Illustrator session, this will probably be familiar to you. The type on a path tool. What is the type on a path tool? Well, let me show you. Let me just make a path real quick, and don't worry, we'll get into what this tool is in a second, but I'm just gonna make a path real quick, and I'm gonna go over the type tool, click type on a path tool. I can hover over a path, and boom, now I can type on this path, and you can see it's all along that path. I just put S's. Let's say you don't want the path there. You just want the text to be there. Well, then we come over here, we select the path. We take this stroke over here, bring that all the way down to 0. Now the path is missing, but the text is still there and still on the path. The path is just kind of invisible. So yeah, let me get rid of that. So those are the options we have for placing text, which is useful in pagination software. And we've got the line tool. The line tool is, it's literally what it sounds like. It's for making lines, just straight lines. Something useful for working with the line tool is if you hold shift while making a line, it'll lock it on 45-degree increments. So perfect horizontal line, 45 degrees, perfect vertical line. And you can just do that in 360 degrees. It'll lock it on 45-degree increments. All right, so that's the line tool. Let me get rid of those. And I'm just using Control-Z to get rid of stuff that I placed down. Then we've got the pen tool. Pen tool's pretty similar to the line tool, except it's got a little bit more functionality to it. Let me move this over. A little more functionality to it. Instead of clicking and dragging to make lines, you click and you make a point. And then you click and you make another point. And then you click and there's another point, and then you click and you make another point. That's how you use the pen tool. And if we click and hold on the pen tool, we get more pen options. And with the pen options, we can do a bunch of cool stuff. Starting off with the, we've already been adding anchor points. So let's try deleting an anchor point and see what happens. When we delete anchor points, we click on a point that we've made and it gets rid of it. And now we only have 2 anchor points. And since we only have 2 anchor points, we only have 1 line. Let's try converting direction point tool. That's kind of a confusing name, but all you have to know about it is if you click on an endpoint and drag, you can turn it into a curved point instead of a hard, sharp point. And you get these nice little, I think they call them handlebars, coming out the side. Dragging them out makes it wider, bring it in closer makes it sharper, and you can change the angle of that point. Cool. And let go and it confirms it. All right. Moving on, we have the pencil tool. The pencil tool I used earlier to make the path for the type on a path tool works pretty much like a pencil. You click and you drag around, and you get a line. Click and drag around, you get a line. Pencil tool has a couple cool options too. It's got the smooth tool, and actually, let me make a different line to show the smooth tool, because a smooth line doesn't really help show the smooth tool. Let me make kind of like a rough and jagged line. So when we have got a rough and jagged line, we can go to the smooth tool, and basically what it does is it removes points and makes it a little bit less choppy. It makes it a little bit more of a smooth, continuous line instead of a bunch of points that are kind of going over each other and being choppy. Useful if you're trying to get a really organic feel to your lines. Moving on, we've got the erase tool. And the erase tool, again, is pretty much what it sounds like. It erases. You can go through, erase portions of your line if that's something that you want to do. Okay, so those were all of the tools associated with the pencil tool. And how much time do we have left? Oh yeah, we have time. Okay, next, this is important. So these next couple tools are really important to working in Adobe InDesign because they are frames. Frames are what you place your content in. So if you understand frames, you can actually put stuff into your file. Let me move this stuff out of the way. So starting out with a rectangle frame tool. This is for you making a rectangle frame. It's exactly what it sounds like. You click and you drag out and you can make a frame. If you hold shift while making a frame, it locks the dimensions so that it makes a perfect square. If you don't hold shift, you will make a rectangle with different height and width. So just that's one of those hotkeys that's can be useful to remember. So boom, we've got a perfect square. Now we want to add content to this frame because right now it's completely empty. I'm going to go over here to where it says import file. Click that, and I have a couple of things already saved. I have the InDesign logo on that document that I gave you guys. If you want to download that, if you're kind of trying to follow along. If not, just this is what I'm using for example. I'm going to click on the InDesign logo. I'm going to open it, and it's going to place that image in the frame. Cool. Now we can click and drag it around, move it around. We can manipulate it just like that. All right, cool. So cool thing about empty frames is it doesn't necessarily have to be an image. Cool thing about InDesign is that you can go to import file, and I'm actually just going to open a text document, which is, it's just a Word document. This is just a little snippet from Dr. Seuss, but you can actually just place text from a Word document. Or any kind of, I think it works with other types of word editing documents too. But this is where we kind of start talking about what I was saying earlier about how it's good for organizing kind of more complex things like books and ebooks and stuff like that. You can place entire Word documents inside of a frame. And from here, you can format the characters and change the spacing and the alignment and stuff like that. Really, really useful stuff. All right, so that's empty frames, which are all well and good and they're fun and all, but what if you just want a frame that has a shape and has a color to it? Then we use this tool right here. It's the rectangle tool. It's technically a solid frame that you don't necessarily add content to. Right now it has a stroke of 1 point and the stroke is black and it has no fill. So let's change that. Let's change the fill from no fill to a nice cyan. There you go. Now you have a square, which is great to work with. And if you were in the Illustrator session, you know that you can make pretty much anything with simple shapes, if that's something that you want to work on getting good at. And then both of these, the frame tool and the rectangle tool, have options for other shapes. You can make ellipses, polygons, stuff like that. You can place things in different shaped frames. It's possibilities are endless. All right, so before we run out of time, I want to get through a couple more of these tools. This is the scissors tool. The scissors tool works in a couple of different ways, but the main way is you use it to, actually, let me select this and bring it down here real quick. Use the scissors tool to cut through your stuff. It's kind of hard to get sometimes. You'll see that if you get it right on the edge, you'll get a little crosshair, and that's what you want. And if you click, you'll make a cut through your frame and you'll cut your elements into different pieces. This can be useful for the most common way I see it used is making pie charts. You make a circle and then you take cuts out of it and you make different sizes, and that's what I see it used for a lot. Moving on, we've got the free transform tool. There's a lot of apps that have a tool similar to this. So this, hopefully you're comfortable with this. When you click on the free transform tool, you get the ability to freely transform it. You can change the width and you can change the height. If you want the dimensions to stay locked, you click on a point and you hold shift, and now it'll lock your width and height so that it scales smoothly. You can also rotate it. And yeah, that's the free transform tool. Moving on, let's work with the gradient tool. Gradient tool is fun, especially when you're trying to make kind of more stylistic designs. We're going to click on this with the gradient tool selected, and now we have a nice gradient. Then we're going to go over here to where it has the fill options. We're going to click on the gradient options, and then we can change the colors. So right now, white on this side of the gradient tool is white, but what if I don't want it to be white? Then I make sure that white is selected here and white is selected here. Then I go over here to the little color palette, and I'm going to pick a different color. I want it to be a nice cyan or light blue or something. All right, then I'm going to go back to the gradient tool, and now it's going from cyan to black, but I don't want it to be black. I'm going to click on black here, click on black here, go to the color palette and pick like a magenta. There we go. Now I've got a nice cyan to magenta gradient filling this square, and that's the gradient tool. And we made it through almost all of the tools. We're going to finish up this toolbar and get into an actual project in the afternoon session. I hope you can join. But before we run out of time, I just want to make sure that you guys don't have any questions. I'm going to leave before we finish off here. I want to see if you guys have any questions.
No questions from me. Thank you, Diego.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I hope that you are getting something out of this training, and I hope you can join us for the afternoon session. If not, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. You have my email, and there's some useful information on that document that I gave you guys. So look over those if you're interested in it. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.